This series of the 50 Faces podcast is proudly brought to you by B Finance, a trusted partner to the world's leading institutional investors. With a proven track record in strategy, implementation, and oversight, B Finance delivers bespoke investment consultancy that empowers asset owners to achieve their unique objectives. Whether it's refining portfolio strategy, selecting fund managers, monitoring performance, or getting better value for money, B Finance combines global expertise with tailored solutions to unlock value for their clients. To learn more about how they've supported over 500 clients in 45 countries, managing assets totaling over $9 trillion, visit bfinance.com.
Well, what motivates me is I love seeing an organization be successful, and I love seeing people around me grow and become successful. I get a real buzz out of that, especially younger people. When you see the talent and you think, right, let's see where this person goes, what they're going to do with it. But you have to give them a chance. You have to give them the exposure. You have to give them the trust.
I'm Aoife Devitt, and welcome to the 50 Faces podcast, a podcast committed to revealing the richness and diversity of the world of investment by focusing on its people and their stories. I'm joined today by Denise Le Gal, who is independent chair at Brightwell, as well as chair and trustee director of JP Morgan Chase Retirement Plan, among other portfolio roles. She was chair of the Brunel Pension Partnership Limited for close to 8 years. Welcome, Denise. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you. Nice to see you.
Well, I'd love to start with a bit of your background, as I only got to know you in the chair role. Can you speak about where you grew up, what you studied, and how you came to enter the world of finance?
Sure. I'm from Winnipeg, just south of Winnipeg, Manitoba. I grew up on a farm, and I'm one of 10 children. I'm number 9 of 10. So on a farm, everyone has to work. And so I had a very strong work ethic from day one, but I couldn't wait to leave the farm. And my mom also ran a nursing home, and I worked there part-time from age 14. And I thought I wanted to become a gerontologist, if that's the correct word. But I changed my mind after some time. But I still have a soft spot for the older generations because we can learn so much from them. Hence why I'm very happy to be working in pensions today. However, if you had told me when I left Canada in 1985, 40 years ago this year, that I would end up working in pensions, I would have been so remote because I knew absolutely nothing about finance. When I went to university, I studied commerce. I wanted to study music, but my father said, "Oh, Denise, study something that you can get work at. You'll never get a job studying music." So I did a BCom for 3 years, which was a part of a 4-year honors program. And he sadly died in my 3rd year of a heart attack. And that summer, I thought it through, and I was very low at him dying so young. But I just thought, sod it, I'm going to apply to the Faculty of Music. And I did. And they had a place for me. And I was able to transfer some credits, but I had to do all the normal musical things. And it was absolutely wonderful. I enjoyed every moment of it. But when I graduated, sure enough, he was right. I couldn't get a job in music. But I got a job in the civil service of Canada. And I was in the finance area of a particular ministry, which was the Ministry of Fisheries and Oceans. And there was a landslide election in 1984 where Brian Mulroney became prime minister after a number of years of a Liberal government. And they didn't really know how to run things. So I was plucked out of the civil service to act as a departmental liaison between the political staff and the civil servants. And I ended up being the chief of finance for that particular senior cabinet minister at quite a young age, but I was on a fast track. And I saw a lot of things that really, really surprised me. And it was a real big eye-opener on how dirty politics can be. And I decided that I would become an MP and I would run the country, basically. That's what I thought at that young age. But I knew that I needed to have a master's degree because in Canada you can't really move along. And so I thought, well, rather than go back and finish that BCom 4th year honors program, I'll do an MBA. But I didn't want to do one in Canada. So I looked at various places in the US and Europe. And when I visited INSEAD, I knew that's where I wanted to go. And fortunately, I got in. The intent was that I would do my MBA. I didn't say I'd then go back to Canada. They said I could go back to the civil service and they'd reimburse me all my tuition fees, etc. It opened my eyes so much, and I just thought I want to stay here on this side of the pond for a few years. And they told us, when you do, I want to work in manufacturing. And they said, well, before you do any interviews, do an interview in somewhere, an area that you're not interested in. So I looked at all the boards that people were coming to on campus to recruit, and I saw this company called Salomon Brothers, which I understood was in finance. And I thought, well, I'll do that because I'm not interested. I don't know anything about finance. I'm not interested in doing that. So I did the interview, and they called me back. And then after 17 interviews, they offered me the job. And the other thing they taught us was to negotiate our salaries. And when they finally offered me the job, they offered me £35,000 as a starting salary, which was double what I had been earning in Canada. So the negotiation tactics went right out the window. And they said, we see you've been at university for a long time, so here's a £5,000 wardrobe allowance. Go buy yourself a couple of nice suits. Oh, and by the way, we'll pay to move all your belongings from Canada. So what was there not to like? Well, actually, there was a lot not to like.
Well, let's just stop there for a second, because that's an extraordinary set of background facts that you've just shared there. Before we move into your Salomon Brothers and onwards, first of all, growing up on a farm, Winnipeg, not the most urban area of Canada, being a mother of 9 myself, to hear that you're one of 10 gives me great confidence in the younger children emerging fully ready for the world. Tell us a little bit about growing up on a farm, what you think that taught you in terms of risk and your attitude to life, as well as being one of 10 children, what that taught you about negotiation. Maybe you were born as a negotiator.
I don't know as a negotiator, but certainly as a team player, because no man can work in isolation. The weather is quite rigorous in Winnipeg. The summers are very hot. You get field fires spontaneously, lightning or whatever else. You have floods sometimes in the spring. In the winter, you have blizzards. So the whole community has to come together. There's an expression, is let George do it. Someone who is lazy or wasn't a community member, they'd say, oh, he's a lazy, let George do it person. So what I've drawn from being raised on a farm, because I've thought about this a lot, I was so desperate to get out of there, but actually it's been a really important part of my DNA, if you like. Number one, I've always understood from day one that Mother Nature's in charge. So you have to respect Mother Nature, and you have to, when the sun is shining and you can get the crops out, do it, because tomorrow they might be gone. And this whole sense of belonging to a community, you have to work together. And my mother always used to say, it doesn't matter if you don't like that person. If you sit along next to them for long enough, you can learn to work with them. And I think that's so true. We don't always like everyone we work with, but actually everyone has something to bring to the table. So everyone's really important in a team and in a company, in an environment. So my whole ethos on climate change and responsible investment is centered a lot around what I saw growing up, because there's so many changes. Like where I'm from, not too far north, is where the polar bears cross the Hudson Bay River to mate. And with the icebergs melting so quickly, they're struggling. So there's all sorts of imbalances that are occurring today because of the jet stream on the North Pole and all kinds of things like that are really impacting our lives. And we've seen it just recently in California, what's going on. And yet we continue to, we support those organizations that are using the most energy and the most, sometimes in not a very good way. So that's one thing that we'll come to probably when we talk about Brunel.
Absolutely. And then another couple of observations, commerce into music. I often see the reverse trajectory, and you did kind of go back again ultimately. But the music part, first of all, was there an instrument? Was it voice? And again, thinking about music, I'm thinking again about, harmony and people coming together. Is there anything studying that brought you?
Well, one thing I often say to people, because I often get asked this question, for me, music was always my opium. My mother was very religious. And I had a lot of questions, and because I was quite curious, and I would get put down. I went to a convent school because those were the best schools, and they didn't like me asking questions, but I was just curious. I'd ask questions like, if the pagans, if they're sincere in what they do, or in other religions, if they're sincere, wouldn't God take that into account when they go up to heaven? That was my question. And I was told I was possessed with the devil, and I was kicked out of catechism for a whole year. And then at the end of the year, that semester or year, I don't remember which it was, I got my report card, which had to go home to my parents to be signed. And they had marked a C on religion. And I said, I went to my form teacher and I said, what's this? Because I'd never had anything below an A up until that point. And he said, well, we felt because you weren't there. And I said, well, why not give me not there or an F but a C? What's that? And he said, I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do about it. And I ripped up my report card and I put it on his desk and I said, I can't show this to my parents. And that, I kind of slammed the door on the Catholic Church at that point in time because I felt it made me feel like such a bad person. But I know today I was not a bad person. I was just curious.
And music then was what you found?
Was my opium. And, I played in bands from age 16 till about 45 or something. Then sang in choirs. And so it's always been a really big part of my life. But in terms of how it relates to finance, well, music is just mathematics with soul, really. There are rhythms, there are patterns. And, we see that in the markets, cycles, patterns. It's all pretty much out of the same part of the brain, I think.
Well, I love that. So from the Solomon Brothers interview, which was done as a test case or a guinea pig for your interview skills, it reminds me of somebody else who ended up in an interview by mistake, having entered the wrong door. But clearly there was a fit. So you were just about to tell us some of the negative things and take us back to your journey in finance.
Yes. Well, Solomon Brothers was, I don't know if you've read the book Liar's Poker, Michael Lewis. Well, he sat 2 seats from me on the trading floor in Victoria Station. And the training class that he refers to in New York was my training class. And I watched 2 people playing. I won't name them, but they're pretty high up and were pretty high up at the time. They were masters of the universe for sure. And they played Liar's Poker for $1 million. And, I was just a kid. The only experience I had living outside of Canada was that year at INSEAD. And yes, I had been a civil servant, but I was still totally Canadian. I didn't understand this rough and tumble of the world of Wall Street. And so it was highly pressurized then, in the 80s. It was the masters of the universe. You had no work-life balance. And you just worked and worked and worked. It was all about money and trying to get big bonuses. The culture was really not me. And within 6 months, I had an ulcer, which, once I knew that, I knew I wasn't dying of a heart attack, which was a bit of a worry. And I got headhunted eventually. Well, first of all, I got made redundant when Solomon Brothers, after the crash, closed all these desks because there was a hostile takeover bid from Ron Perlman. And so they let go of a whole load of people. And I remember saying, because of course I'd never had anything, I saw it as a complete failure. And the MD said, don't take this personally. I said, can I not take this personally? You placed me on that desk. And he said, well, just go home, enjoy the week, the week, and here's an envelope. And so when I opened the envelope, I thought, gee, this is a gift because I had a massive payout. And I had already been starting being headhunted. So I ended up going to Chase Manhattan, which was a far better culture. Chase had been in London by that time, around 100 years. On my first business trip, which was to Portugal, I got to Portugal and I said, can we go to the Chase building, please? And he said, yes. And at the end of the thing, I gave him the equivalent of a 20-pound note in his screw dose. And he said, who do you think I am, David Rockefeller? So because Chase Manhattan had led the lifeboat in the 70s when Portugal was essentially having some very serious problems. So I really enjoyed working there at Chase Manhattan. It was really, I was there for about 6 years and then I was headhunted. One was the Lehman Brothers and the other was to IBJ. I accepted the contract with Lehman Brothers and the headhunter said, you're making a big mistake. You really can't do that. And this is what the IBJ is prepared to pay you. And it was silly money. And they said, you'll have a much better life than at Lehman. And I consulted a few of the people that I would talk to about things like this. And so I rang Lehman and I said, look, will you let me out of that contract because I think I've made a mistake? And they said, fine, God bless. And I went to work for IBJ as their head of options, OTC options. And that was a bit of an eye-opener. At the time, we're talking 92 or 93, I can't remember exactly. There was a lot of loans that were really bad in the Japanese banks. And it was an interesting time. And it has changed. But as a woman, I had to go to all the board meetings, but I was never made a board member, even though I had been promised. So it was tough. I really didn't like it there. So when my contract came to an end, it came to an end. And that was, I was very happy to go. It coincided with my youngest getting quite seriously ill. So I decided to take some time off. And I was telling everyone I was on a sabbatical. It took me 1.5 years to admit to myself that I wasn't working anymore, in the city. So I started a little company, which was nothing really interesting. And eventually I got dragged into politics as a counselor eventually a county councillor. And that's how I got into pensions. Because the day after I was elected, I handed my CV to the leader, and he said, "Oh, we want you to run the Surrey Pension Fund." Because I had advised pension funds all those years. And that's how I met Phil Triggs and legends like that, and Tracy Milner, and now Neil Mason. And we had a whale of a time changing governance. The governance was so different then.
Well, that's when I first got to know you. And I remember wondering, how did a Canadian end up as a county councillor in Surrey? And so it was, now you filled in the gaps there. Well, let's fast forward now to a little bit of the portfolio career, which is, I think, your expertise today, which, is so well entrenched. And it's interesting that you've come full circle with the JP Morgan Chase retirement plan trustee director role, given your early Chase phase there. I'd love to talk about the chair and committee roles you hold today and ask you, since you've been there, done that now for a decade, what is it that you bring to these roles, and what do you think makes an effective director and chair?
The question of leadership is a really tough one because, literally hundreds of books have been written about the subject. And you go through the last 50 years, and some used to say, oh, children of immigrants or people with a hard work ethic, blah, blah, blah. And there's no real conclusions about what makes a good leader. And I've been often asked, why do you lead? Why are you happy to be in charge? And the only thing I can think of is that it's because I can. I'm not afraid of it. I'm not afraid of the responsibility because, generally speaking, if you have the right tools in place to ensure that your governance is good and you have the right people there, usually things work out pretty well. So the biggest things to worry about is who you have on the team, how well they work together, and what's your culture like. That's incredibly important. And egos can get in the way of that. I really like working with people who, well, what motivates me is I love seeing an organization be successful, and I love seeing people around me grow and become successful. I get a real buzz out of that, especially younger people. When you see the talent and you think, right, let's see where this person goes, what they're going to do with it. But you have to give them a chance. You have to give them the exposure. You have to give them the trust. So chairing is a sharing thing, really. And you, as a chair of an organization that has a C-suite, you don't have any say, really. You don't have any power. You can only influence. So with the CEOs that I work with, and I've worked with, I try not to tell them what to do. I never tell them what to do. There's only one example where I didn't even tell anyone what to do, but when Putin was about to invade Ukraine, we had a board meeting, we were talking about this, and I said, well, what are our fund managers thinking? So they went to all the fund managers, and all the fund managers, every single one of them said, he's not going to invade. And meanwhile, there was 150,000 troops sitting around the border. So, if it looks like a duck and it walks like a duck, chances are it's probably a duck. So we had a board meeting and I said, well, do we agree that we instruct everyone to get out if we have exposure? Well, it turned out we didn't have much exposure, so it wasn't a big deal. But we did agree that we would not allow any investment, no matter how tempting it would be, on especially a currency play. We don't really do tactical stuff, but somebody's always making money in these crises. But this was not one that we wanted to take advantage of.
Just to dig in a little bit to something you said, I think it's fascinating around not being afraid to lead. Because I think, what are people actually afraid of when they're afraid to lead? They're afraid of making a mistake, afraid of getting it wrong, and afraid of the shame or having to explain themselves then. Because everybody is going to make a mistake. Every decision could be ultimately the wrong result, but it's a question of the process. How did you build that sense of not being afraid? Because there is that real need to make decisions and be convicted in them.
Yeah, well, like you said, we all make mistakes. And when we come to Brunel, I've made mistakes there. We always make mistakes. I've made mistakes with my children. I'm sure you have. That's part of life. It's what we do with it and how we deal with it. That's important, I think. And I don't know. I think being afraid is not terribly healthy to be afraid, because very often we worry about things that we don't have to worry about. And in fact, if we look at a scenario and we think, oh, what should I do? Well, it's important to look at all options. But my advice to other people is, having weighed up all those options, take the one that requires the most courage. And then anything else seems easy, because it's never a straight line. Nothing's ever a straight line. And plan A might end up being plan X, Y, or Z. I don't know, So it's much more about being able to be agile in whatever you're doing.
I love that. I think I will add to the mix two emotions. Well, one more emotion besides fear that's not helpful. The other one is guilt. From one working mother to another, I think that guilt emotion that often gets thrown around these decisions you have to make.
My great Jewish friend who stood up for me at my wedding, and I stood up for her at hers, she always says guilt is optional. And she doesn't always live it. That's the thing.
Great life advice there. And so let's dive into Brunel a little bit, because clearly these pooled companies are very much in the headlines today, and we've got more governance change coming. Love to talk to you about looking back almost 8 years at Brunel in terms of what you're proud of, what you achieved there, and then whether your views on governance evolved during that time.
My views on governance evolved a lot more when I was at Surrey, because governance in the LGPS was very different then. It was a committee. It wasn't even a committee. Sorry, it was an advisory group, an audit. It was the audit committee that looked, it was just no bank account. It's commingled with the treasury funds, that sort of thing. So I learned a lot about governance there. But coming back to Brunel, what am I proud of? All of it. I'm proud of everything that happened there. The partnership had many challenges, and the road was quite rocky at times. But to sum it up, I'd say that through it all, the smiles outweighed the frowns. And I'm super proud of the team there, how they led on responsible investments. Faith Ward, she's an icon, and the whole responsible investment team. Many organizations have borrowed our stuff and are using it. And, all the development we did on the net zero framework and TCFD, we were participating in all of that stuff. So I'm really proud of that. And I'm also proud that people want to work at Brunel because they feel free to be themselves and that their work is important, then that they're maybe making a difference just in a small way because they care about the world and they care about the real economy. And I'm proud that I will have enduring, strong relationships that I formed during my time there for at least for the foreseeable future. It was an absolute pleasure and an honor to have led Brunel and with such brilliant people. And I really want to thank those who gave me that opportunity. But I would say one thing, that one of the biggest challenges, it's really important to think strategically and to have a vision for the future. But that can be really scary for some people because some people are afraid of change. I'm not particularly afraid of change. And so one needs to gain consensus for that vision to be enacted and to come to life. But building that consensus, from my experience, has to be done in bite-sized chunks. If you go slamming in, in 5 years' time, this is where we're going to be, that's quite scary. But if you ask, when we were 5 years in, Laura Chappell was the CEO, and I said, Laura, did you think we'd be where we are 5 years ago? And she said, absolutely not. I said, me neither, not in my wildest dreams. We couldn't really hire, we didn't have anything when we started. No office, no people, nothing. No policies, no RI policy, no any policy. So it's been, when you think about the amount that has been achieved by the pools, like most of the pools in such a short time, it's quite impressive, I think.
It is. And I think you say something really interesting about that vision for the future, because I think one of the biggest stumbling blocks to some of the entities that comprise the pool in building a vision for the future is it does become existential at a certain time, that concern, because there will be positions disappearing, roles disappearing. And yet another thing that almost becomes kind of a nuisance in the governance point is training. Training is like a box that gets to be ticked and, often doesn't get a trustee training we talk about. But if we think about the training that's required to be able to evolve in one's career, so an existential crisis doesn't become as much of a threat, that's something that is usually quite abundant in the LGPS structure, the access to training. So I suppose I understand the resistance to change because it can involve essentially losing a job that's been a civil service job that has been held for decades. But I think if we can ensure that training is poured on to those stakeholders that can enable them to succeed throughout the change, that might be the answer to making it less fearful.
Well, we'll see what happens as a result of the consultation, which closes tomorrow. And it's been interesting from the little I've seen on which stakeholders, how they respond may be very different from one stakeholder to another. But it's inevitable. The industry, especially in the private sector, they're crying out for change. They have been for years on an accounting basis, on all sorts of bases. So it's great to see that this government and the previous chancellor, they were aligned on this in terms of getting investment into the UK through the pension funds, because we had been saying to them for a long time, yes, but you have to enable that. You can't put up stumbling blocks that means that for all sorts of reasons. We're not an insurance company. So we'll see what happens.
Indeed. And well, let's move now to the post-Brunel life you've built, and you're now independent chair of Brightwell. Can you tell us what appealed to you about that role?
Well, for anyone who doesn't know, Brightwell is the operating platform for the British Telecom Pension Fund. The trustee board for that pension fund have decided they're going to run on. They're not doing buyout, mainly for all sorts of reasons, but including the loss of value and to some extent the concentration risk that exists in insurance companies. But the CEO, Morton Nelson, who's brilliant, was concerned that about as the funds mature, we have 70% of our membership in retirement already, and we pay out about $2 billion a year, I think, in pensions. So retaining staff is quite tricky if you're going down to one last man standing. So the trustee board of BT agreed that Brightwell could be created and opened up to merge, effectively form partnerships a bit like the pools for their assets and their member services, including pensions administration. So when that opportunity came up, I knew that my time at Brunel was soon coming to an end, but I saw that as a similar challenge, but in the private sector. And I was very, very excited about it and very pleased and honored to have been given the opportunity to be part of that team. The future looks really bright. And what I like the most about that is that, and there are discussions with government, as I'm sure you're aware of, about the PPF levies and sharing surpluses. All of that is a bit up in the air. But there's an opportunity here to really boost value for those companies and their members, potentially. So the world looks bright.
Well, that's very exciting. And thank you for sharing. I don't think many of us knew what was going on at Brightwell or even what it stood for. I want to just circle back to something that you brought up a little bit in terms of diversity in the industry, as this is one of the questions I ask across all these podcasts, is just, I suppose, for an experienced practitioner like yourself, who's come decades in the financial industry, your thoughts on the current levels of diversity in it. It's become a lightning rod topic right now, on this side of the Atlantic anyway, that I'm on. Any interventions that you've seen as being impactful to move the needle and improve the diversity?
Well, it has improved a lot from when I started out. On the dealing room floor at Solomon Brothers, of the professionals, there were 220, I think, on the trading floor, 5 of whom were women. It wasn't very much. And the prospects for promotion were zilch almost. Well, at Brunel, we looked at this a lot because we were in Bristol and we were worried about hiring people. So we did some outreach work with some of the universities. And it's amazing how now when I look at the staff at Brunel, it's much, much more diverse than it was when we started out. And it's great. I don't think they think about gender in the same way that, we might have thought, oh, he's such a chauvinist pig, or, they don't seem to have that kind of language. And I don't know if that's because there's been a conscious conversation and more open conversations about mental health and all of that, or that we're a bit more woke, if that's a word that I'm allowed to use. I never know if I'm allowed to use that word or not, but I'm just trying to express what I think we've progressed in being more open about our personal lives. When I look back, I never have dreamt to tell you about the farm, because I would have wanted you to think that I was from generations of bankers, But actually today it doesn't matter, does it? It's good that people have. We want to hear about what makes people tick.
Preaching to the choir here, but that is wonderful. I didn't even think of the fact that these human stories would have been suppressed. I just thought we never gave people the time to tell them, but you do make an interesting point. Now, I'd just like to circle back for a few quick personal reflections. We started with the personal, and it's been a wonderfully rich discussion so far. Key people, where we speak a lot about mentorship, sponsorship as being key to progression through careers. Some of us are lucky enough to have mentors or sponsors, some not. Did you have any key people that influenced you in your career or life?
Yeah, I had a few. I want to highlight one because she was quite an early mentor. Her name is Landon Mackenzie Pearson, and she was a huge influence in my life. She was an advocate, an author, a speaker, a senator in the House of Parliament in Canada, which is like the House of Lords, and all because she was a champion for the voices of children and youth all her life. Over the course of her life, she worked tirelessly to build a Canada that was fit for children, and her husband was an ambassador to Russia and other countries, and she wrote books about children in other places. Anyway, the way I met her was in 1979, the UN launched a commission for the International Year of the Child. And she was spearheading the Canadian Commission for the International Year of the Child. I don't honestly remember how I got the job, but I was there sort of to help her as an assistant of sorts. And she took me under her wing, and she was just so fascinating. And I got to go to the UN. I was 20 or 21. I can't remember how old I was, 21, I think. I got to go to the UN to do research on a paper on handicapped children. That's what we called it then. We wouldn't use that word now, but that's what it was called. And she was just an unbelievable person. She taught me the importance of having purpose and the importance of persistence and stamina. And one of the buildings at my university was named after her. And in 2008, she had made a special advisor to the government on children's affairs, and she was awarded the Order of Canada for her extraordinary contributions, which changed the way children's rights are understood in Canada. And when our time came to leave, she said to me, when our time ended, she said, "I'll be interested to see how your career evolves. But one piece of advice, remember that success in life is not based on principles. It's based on adaptability." And I've stood by that ever since. And I call them my 3 A's: adaptability, agility, and authenticity. And if you stick by that, usually you'll get to where you need to be.
I love that. And I also am reflecting back at so many of these pensions discussions I've had, that what grounds the individuals behind them are never losing sight of the members, the ultimate beneficiaries at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And I think Brunel does that so well. I think many of the other pools do too. And that's the connect that needs to never be forgotten. And focusing on children is a very similar thing. Who are we doing this for if it is not the next generation? So I love that parallel that you've drawn there. And you kind of preempted the next question, which is around the words of wisdom with your 3 A's. So just as a last question, any other creed or motto, advice for your younger self, any nugget to leave us with in terms of how you approach life and would sort of think is a word of wisdom for others to think about?
Well, when I started in the city, I talked about how it was in the 80s with all the stuff about just pursuit of money and all of that. And I would say follow your bliss. And, I never regretted that music degree. And now I have a little bit more time. I want to do a bit more music, but my problem is I don't have much time. But if I was to start over, I would say to my younger self, get a better life balance, because it's not all about work. And money is, it's a good thing to have, but it's not a panacea. And my father always said, if you just work for the sake of money, you'll never hang on to it if that's what's driving you. And I look at the great people that I've met, and I've been lucky that I've met many, many great people. And I've met lots of prime ministers, presidents. And I noticed that for them, it's not power that drives them. It's like Bill Clinton said to us, a group of us in a private session, he said, if I know that I've just made one small difference through the Clinton Foundation, I'll be happy that I have a legacy. Because as a president, you don't really have any power. At best, you have influence. And I thought those were very wise words.
And I love that. I feel like we're ending on the concept of impact. And certainly that's a buzzword within local government circles, within investment circles. If it's not power that drives you, it is having impact. However, apparently small, having some impact and leading with purpose. Well, thank you so much, Denise. I didn't even reflect on the fact that we are both fellow INSEAD alums. And this has been
about that.
Yes. So well, that only makes me feel even more proud of that legacy. So it's been, I think this discussion started with authenticity, starting on the farm, starting with humility before nature, and has been a profile of courageous leadership throughout. So thank you so much for sharing your insights and for giving us the inspiration to lead and act as board directors as you have. And thank you for sharing your wisdom with us.
Well, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. See you soon, I hope.
I'm Aoife Devitt. Thank you for listening to the 50 Faces podcast. If you liked what you heard and would like to tune in to hear more inspiring investors and their personal journeys, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice, and all views are personal and should not be attributed to the organisations and affiliations of the host or any guest.